Well, I'm joined now, rejoined, in fact, by a guest I had last night, Fred Hagen, who was on board the last two Titan missions, and knows two of the people on board, Stockton Rush and Paul Henry Nargeolet. Well, Fred, I'm really sad to speak to you again now that we know the news, which I think we both probably feared yesterday but didn't want to say, that very sadly everyone on board has lost their lives. What is your reaction to what we just heard?
Well, Piers, as you can imagine, sitting here listening to this press conference while waiting to talk to you has made this much more difficult than I anticipated. And I can only say that the world has lost two radiant points of light with Stockton and PH. And as we talked yesterday, these men were great men who tried greatly and risked everything. And I want their epitaph to be what Teddy Roosevelt said, that the credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, and who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. And that, to me, is the true epitaph of Stockton Rush and P.H. Nargeolet and their companions. And I'm very sorry. It was just devastating sitting here listening to the realization of what we all feared and then trying to express my feelings moments later. I apologize.
Fred, there's no apology obviously needed at all. I know from our conversation yesterday how personally moved you've been by this. The rest of the world has watched on in sort of mounting horror as this story has unraveled. For you, it was incredibly personal. You've been on this vessel, you've been on the last two Titanic missions in 2021 and 22 with Stockton Rush, with your friend PH. He'd been down to that wreckage 30 odd times, I think, and brought back so many extraordinary things for the world to see. He was a genuine historian in that sense. We're looking at a picture of you all now. It's a desperately sad time for you and for everyone who knew them, their friends, their families, everyone. And it's a sad time, I think, for the world to look on and see people who ultimately, as I said yesterday, I got very angry about the reaction from certain people about the fact that they were wealthy people paying to go down there and so on. To me, they were intrepid explorers. It doesn't matter how much money you have. They're intrepid explorers. And some are paid to be there and some were being paid to be there. It makes no difference. The goal was to go down and find new information which could shed light on one of the great tragedies of the history of this planet, which was the sinking of the Titanic. And I commend them for the courage that it took to do that. And I think that their death is an absolute tragedy. But they should be remembered as heroes who went down there. I wouldn't go down there. I mean, I admire you for doing it. You know, it's an extraordinary thing to want to do.
And Piers, I'd like to say that right now at this point in time, the death toll from the Titanic tragedy has risen from 1,517 to 1,522, and may God rest their souls.
Yeah, I mean, it is an eerie thing, isn't it, when you think about the Titanic and the huge death loss, as you say, and the fact they were going down there to see there and have now lost their lives. There was a very poignant interview, actually, with the older sister of Shahzada Dawood, who said she felt absolutely heartbroken that both her brother and, of course, her nephew, who's only 19, is a student at Strathclyde University. And this is Asma Dawood, who was the aunt of that young boy and the sister of his father on board as well. I feel like I've been caught in a really bad film, she said, with a countdown, but you didn't know what you're counting down to. I've personally found it incredibly difficult to breathe thinking of them. She then said that her nephew didn't want to go on the submersible, but agreed to take part because it was important to his father, a lifelong Titanic obsessive. The Suleiman, she said, wasn't very up for it and was terrified, explaining the 19-year-old had expressed his concerns to the family member. But that is, of course, part of, I guess, the adventure. And yes, it's ended in appalling circumstances. It's cost that young man his life. But his father obviously was enthralled by the history of this and wanted to be part of that history and to go down there and to explore. And again, I think it's a heroic and noble thing to do that kind of thing. Most people don't get the chance to do it and don't have the inclination to do it.
Most people live lives of quiet desperation, and these men lived large. They realized their dreams, they pursued them, and they should be celebrated.
It's been revealed by the Coast Guard. It doesn't appear to be any connection between the underwater banging noises that were identified yesterday coming every 30 minutes and the location of where this debris was found. So they seem to be saying there doesn't appear to be any connection there. Does that suggest to you, Fred, that this catastrophic implosion may have happened quite quickly after they went down? What would be your reading of this?
Well, clearly it happened very quickly. I was originally critical of the fact that those in command did not allow the Brits to immediately mobilize the Magellan. And obviously that was because they'd heard a seismic event and they interpreted it as a catastrophic failure. And then those noises were heard and there was a change of heart. The French came last night. They showed up on site for their beloved PH. And, I believe that the Magellan was finally mobilized. And that was as a result of hearing those knocking noises. But yes, at this point, clearly there was a catastrophic failure on the descent. And while we're all devastated by the loss of these wonderful human beings, at the same time, there's another little part of me that is relieved that they have not spent the last several days dying slowly in the most horrific, nightmarish condition.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. From what I've read, when this kind of implosion occurs, it literally takes milliseconds and nobody on board would even be aware of it. It is catastrophic and instant.
That is correct. And at least they were spared any suffering. And that is some solace to PH's daughter and to the families, to Stockton's widow, Wendy, and to all the others. I didn't know the other passengers, but it is a small solace.
You talk about PH, this extraordinary man. He served in the French Navy for 25 years. He was known as Titanic's greatest explorer. According to his biography, he was widely considered the leading authority on the Titanic shipwreck. What was he like as a man, Fred?
Well, you would never have known that he was the preeminent deep diving expert on Earth. He was a consummate professional, but you would sit down with him and he would be just as warm and relaxed as your oldest friend. And as someone else said, whether he was just as comfortable on the deck of a ship in a tornado as he was sitting in a Parisian cafe. I mean, that was very true. And that was PH. He was very down to earth. He was both incredibly accomplished and incredibly humble.
You've been on this. You've been on the same missions. Did you have moments, Fred, where you felt unnerved, scared even? I mean, how intimidating is the experience of doing this kind of journey?
It can be very intimidating. PH would always be calm, and there are some people that are just calm under stress, and I like to think I'm one of them. There were a few moments when we got kind of the currents pulled us into the ship, and we were momentarily entangled, and I know that others on the sub were maybe more unnerved than and they wanted to immediately ascend. For my part, I wanted to see the stern, and one of the experiences I had last year is we went all around the bow and explored it, and I wanted to go to the stern on the same day. I wanted to be the first person to see both pieces on the same day. And we tried. And when we got back, Wendy and Stockton were both incredulous and saying, "Well, what on earth were you doing? Why were you trying to get to the stern?" And of course, I was blamed for our perseverance. So I'm not sure if I answered your question or addressed it, but yes, there were moments, but they did not in any way diminish my appetite to experience the Titanic and experience this wonderful adventure with PH and Arjolet. And I'll always treasure that event, and I'll always treasure his friendship.
We have a statement just in from the British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly. Tragic news that those on the Titan submersible, including 3 British citizens, have been lost following an international search operation. The UK government is closely supporting the families affected and expresses our deepest condolences. Stockton Rush, inevitably, I guess, as the CEO and founder of OceanGate, he's come under, in the last few days, a lot of criticism along with the company for maybe cutting corners and not doing enough to make the Titan properly secure for this kind of mission. You know, I don't think we should labour that point now that he's so sadly lost his life. But what is your response, Fred, to that particular criticism that it wasn't really ready to do this kind of thing?
The only criminal act was the failure of governments to properly fund science and deep water exploration. What Stockton did was to pursue cutting edge technology to take human beings into a realm where they've never gone before. You know, previously you had government funded submersibles, maybe that whole 1 or 2 people that have gone that deep. You've never had anyone try to democratize the depths, trying to take humanity where it never belonged, it was never able to access. And I look at it kind of like the original flyers, as I mentioned previously. The Wright brothers took off and left the surly bonds of Earth. Do you know how many people died trying to make aviation safe and where anybody could participate safely? They died by the hundreds, by the scores, and they gave their lives trying to, stretch the envelope, to exceed expectations, to go further and farther and faster. And Stockton was doing that. He was doing it in the depths of the ocean, which is the great frontier on Earth, the last unexplored region of Earth, which is so critical to our own future and critical to the preservation of life on Earth.
And Hamish Hardy.
And I'll just add. I'm sorry, Piers. I'll just add that a lot of the criticism that's mounting up. I hear things. I can't tell how many times I've heard about the joystick. It's a video game joystick, and it's that's funny, and people laugh and they make fun of it. Well, that's the difference between a government-funded project and a brilliant entrepreneur who is trying to push boundaries. The government would have spent tens of millions of dollars designing a joystick that would have worked perfectly and brilliantly. Stockton Rush was able to find a joystick that worked just as efficiently by using a video game controller. And one thing I know beyond any doubt is whatever happened to that submersible, it had nothing to do with the video game controller.
Fred, I'm so sorry that this has ended the way it has for your 2 great friends. It's a very sad day, I think, for everyone who's ever been down on that expedition to the Titanic, and to lose people who've so experienced, so attached to that, must be a huge loss to you, both professionally, I guess, and also obviously personally. And I really appreciate you joining me so soon after that news was broken.
Thank you, Piers. And I'll say again, thank you so much for your attitude and for your gracious handling of this tragedy. I deeply, deeply appreciate it. And I know the family does too.
Well, thank you, Fred. And I mean it. I'm sincere about that. I think these people are heroic when they do this kind of thing. And to attack them because of how much money they may have is completely missing the point to me. Fred Hagen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, just to recap for viewers who are tuning in, the very sad breaking news that the Titan submersible, which had been missing for 3 days down near the wreckage of the Titanic, sadly, it's now transpired, suffered a catastrophic implosion. We don't know exactly when that happened, but debris from the vessel was discovered at about 2:30 p.m. UK time this afternoon, just before 9 a.m. Eastern time in America. They discovered a series of items from the debris which were identifiable as coming from the Titan, including a nose cone, the front end of the pressure hull, the back end of the pressure hull, which made it clear this was indeed the missing vessel. And very sadly, that also meant that all 5 of the people on board had lost their lives. So a very sad end to a story which has gripped the world